Okay, Dr. Jenkins here. This is our last video for you to watch for the whole semester. That's probably going to make you pretty happy. But before we start doing the happy dance, let's get through what we need to get through. So this is our last unit, and there isn't a lab associated with this. My goal here is just to introduce some of the functional anatomy. As always, I'm going to let you know what you need to know. The information that we cover is fair game for the final exam. Okay, so if we're talking about the neck and the spine, let me pick, maybe red will be good for this color. You can read right from your notes the functions. The neck and the spine is all about support, holding up the body, the ability to give some flexibility. So really the two biggest ones would be support and the ability to give some flexibility. As we're going to find out, the amount of flexibility varies depending on region, whether it's cervical, thoracic, or lumbar. But we'll talk about it. Okay, so the anatomy, I'm hoping, is a pretty simple review. Everyone hopefully remembers that the top region is cervical, and there are 7 cervical vertebrae that make up the cervical region. So you know that the top one is cervical, there are 7. Then we move down to the thoracic, and there are 12. Then we move down to the lumbar, of which there are 5. And then we have the sacrum, and the coccyx is just a little tailbone. The easy way to remember these numbers would be breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So you may have breakfast at 7 a.m., lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. Okay, now let's start talking about some functional anatomy. The cervical vertebrae gives a little support, so a small amount of support. It obviously isn't going to be taking as much as the lower regions because there's not as much body weight on it. Here, we rely much more on movement. This is where we're going to see most of our movement. The thoracic vertebrae, of course, are going to give us some support and a little bit more support now that we're moving further down the vertebral column and there's more weight to support. But also, the thoracic vertebrae are the connection points posteriorly. Let me just say connection for the ribs. Have you ever thought about this? There are 12 thoracic vertebrae and there are 12 ribs. So posteriorly, each rib is going to connect with a thoracic vertebra. And of course, the lumbar is going to be mostly for support. Being that it's lower, there's the most weight to bear and much less movement. Okay. Pretty simple. I got plenty of pictures here. You can see how for the thoracic vertebrae, and that's what this is. For the thoracic, we can see the rib coming over, articulating in actually 2 different spots. This is the main articulation spot there, right? And then, of course, anteriorly, the ribs come around and attach to the costal cartilage, which then goes to the rib cage. Plenty of pictures here to show you. I want to remind you that the first cervical vertebra, the C1, is called the atlas. So make sure you review that. C1 is atlas. It's a little bit more oval shaped. Really bad at drawing here. So this is what a cervical C1, the atlas, might look like, versus the C2 is the axis. And what makes the C2 unique is that it has the vertical projection. When I teach A&P, I'm not trying to be grotesque or anything, but I call it the mini penis because it makes people remember it. So the axis has the dens, or that vertical projection. And of course, the dens is going to fit up into the atlas, and that's what allows us to have a lot of motion between C1 and C2. All right, cool. There's much more information in your notes. You only need to know what we are reviewing. Okay, so not only do we need to be able to identify the basic anatomy, but we need to be able to identify the curvatures. So if you look at the vertebral column from a lateral viewpoint, we've got lordotic and kyphotic curvatures. Let's first talk about the kyphotic. These are present in the thoracic region and the sacral region. These arrows are a little bit off here, but there we go. In this picture, if you were to look at it, it looks like a C shape. Extra, this is going to be extra. The kyphotic curve tends to be primary, which means that it's present from birth, but I'm not going to ask you that. If you hear my noise in the background, it's just my notes to make sure I know what it is I'm going to ask you to know and what not, because otherwise I'll just go off the rails and start talking way too much. The lordotic curvature is present in the cervical and the lumbar, and it looks more like a backwards C. This is technically called a secondary curve because it is not present at birth. It develops a little bit after. But for you, all you need to know is where we find these curvatures. The kyphotic curvature is a normal C-shaped curvature in the thoracic and sacral regions. The lordotic curve is the backward C shape. My cats are wrestling and knocking everything over. I guess they wouldn't be cats if they weren't knocking things over. Okay, and the lordotic curvature is the backward C shape found in the cervical and lumbar regions. These are considered normal curvatures to a certain extent. So you can see in this picture, there's a certain amount of curvature there. Not too much, not too little. We have a little bit more here in the lumbar region, a little bit more. And then, we have a normal amount here. Again, it shouldn't be too much, shouldn't be too little. And then the same here. So this approximates what's considered normal. However, if they are exaggerated, then we get what's called kyphosis and lordosis. There's Oscar making a presence. Okay. So the key here is to look at the end of the word, lordotic and kyphotic. When you see those O-T-I-C, that tells us it's a normal curvature, lordotic and kyphotic. However, if we add osis, lordosis, kyphosis, that means exaggerated and abnormal. So lordosis is an exaggerated lordotic curve. The lordotic curve should be, that. But if it's too much, if it's exaggerated, we don't call it lordotic, we call it lordosis. One way to think about that exaggerated lordosis would be to think about the sway back. That's the quote unquote sway back. And then we can also talk about kyphosis. There's a normal kyphotic curve, shouldn't be that much. If it's exaggerated, we call it kyphosis. And this would be a hunchback. Okay. Key takeaway points are normal, lordotic, and kyphotic, exaggerated, lordosis, and kyphosis. All right. Additionally, if we look from behind, posteriorly, from a posterior view, the vertebral column should be straight. I don't know why they decided to start wrestling right when I was recording, because they do. So from behind, instead of the vertebral column being straight up and down, if it's more of a lateral curvature, we call it scoliosis. The other ones we were looking from the lateral viewpoint. Here we're looking from the back. So a lateral curvature from the back is scoliosis. Okay, we're going to point out some of the joints, not all. Let's first talk about the atlanto-occipital joint. Like every other joint we've talked about, pretty much, everyone, the joint is named for the bones they connect. So atlanto-occipital, the joint between the occipital bone of the skull, occipital, and the atlas, joint between the atlas and the occipital bone. So this is, my friends, right where the skull rests on the atlas. So the joint is right there. It's pretty wild if you think about it, because we have a pretty big skull and it's not heavy, but considering that it's only resting on that one vertebra, it's a pretty large amount of weight just on this one vertebra. This is a condyloid joint. You don't need to know that if you're wondering. One end is concave and one end is convex, but I'm not going to ask you that. What I would like to point out is this is the joint that allows us to do the yes motion. In other words, neck flexion and extension. When you say yes, like, oh my God, I love kinesiology. You probably aren't saying that, but when you say yes, that motion, forward and backward, flexion and extension, is due to the atlanto-occipital joint. Then we move down and we have the atlanto-axial joint. Sometimes even I need to rewind and just make sure I'm saying the right thing. Atlanto-axial joint. So now we have the joint between the atlas and the axis, C1 and C2. Here we can see that C2 is right here. And remember, C2 in red has that vertical projection that I called the mini penis. That comes up inside C1, which I've put in black here. This forms a pivot joint. Shouldn't be surprising. I'd like you to know that. Excuse me. So the dens of the axis points up into the opening of the atlas, forming a pivot joint where the atlas pivots side to side on the axis. It's a pivot joint, and this is responsible for the side to side or no motions. If you move your head to say no, perhaps like, actually, I don't like kinesiology. That no motion is being allowed by the joint between the atlas and the axis. There is a transverse ligament holding that in place, reminiscent of the annular ligament that went around the head of the radius in the forearm, but you don't need to know that. Okay, moving on down, we have the zygoapophyseal joints. These are also called the facet joints. Zygoapophyseal or facet joints. To begin this discussion, the facet joints are where the vertebrae stack on top of each other. Again, excuse me. This is where the vertebrae stack on top of each other. So from a lateral view, you have these articular processes. Maybe you remember this from anatomy and physiology. You have a superior articular process of one vertebra, which articulates with the inferior articular process of the other. That joint, folks, it's a synovial joint. It's got surrounding ligaments. It's got a little joint capsule. This is a gliding joint. It's a synovial joint. It's got a little joint capsule, it's got fluid, it's got surrounding ligaments, all those good things. The type of motion is just gliding. So we don't see a lot of gross movement here, but we see some gliding. And it might only be a couple degrees here and there, but it does help the overall motion of the vertebral column. All right. Okay, so when we look at the overall movements of the spine, we're talking about all these joints working together. Up high, we have the atlanto-occipital joint and the atlanto-axial joint. They're going to work to move your neck, yes motion and no motion. But what about the rest? Well, it is the combination of all these facet joints. Each little facet joint, each individual one has only a couple degrees of movement, but when they all work together, it allows us to do flexion. Flexion is when you bend your trunk forward. Extension would be if you move your torso backward. Okay, so what are the main points to take home? The main points to take home are that the top two joints move the head at the neck, the atlanto-occipital and the atlanto-axial. Those are going to move at the neck, yes and no motions. Once we move down and we start to talking about trunk motion, this is going to be the combination of all the tiny zygoapophyseal joints. So each individual one just does a tiny amount of motion, but when they all work together, then it allows us to do trunk flexion, bend forward, trunk extension, bend backward. Most of this motion is happening in the cervical area, and we actually see a decent amount in lumbar. So bending forward, trunk flexion, extending, trunk extension, lateral. We can do some lateral movement, some twisting. It's mostly at the cervical and lumbar, which means that there's not as much at the thoracic. Not as much motion there. Those are the main takeaway points I'd like you to know now. Okay. I've given you some range of motion as I usually do, but you don't need to know them specifically. It's possible to measure these. It's not quite as easy as it was with the goniometer for the other places. You can use an inclinometer or other devices. You don't need to know that, I'm just telling you. But let's talk about the intervertebral discs. What good would it be to have just bone on bone? Wouldn't be so good. So, we have these intervertebral discs in the middle. I know you've heard of them. Let's talk about their structure. So, the inner portion is called the nucleus pulposus. Nucleus tells us it's the middle. Nucleus pulposus. This is where we have most of the give. This is a more kind of watery or aqueous solution. It's softer, more give. The outer bands are called the annulus fibrosus. They're made up of fibrocartilage, which is the toughest, strongest fibrocartilage we have in our body. The annulus fibrosus is more about shock absorption. We obviously rely on both, but these are a little bit tougher. You know, the menisci in the knee, they're made up of fibrocartilage. So you can think about them in this way, maybe. You know, we think of the menisci as being pretty tough pieces of cartilage. Same here. They're tough, and they do a good job of that shock absorption. You can see I have a picture here of a s'more, because that's the way I like to think about it, where the marshmallow is the intervertebral disc. In a moment, we'll talk about bulging discs, and I find the s'more analogy to be useful. All right, you can see I've listed some of the ligaments. There's so many. You don't need to know them. I'm just pointing out that there's a bunch of ligaments. There's some ligaments that run the entire length of the vertebral column anteriorly, that run the entire length posteriorly. There's some that run in between each individual vertebra. There's a whole bunch, but you don't need to know them. All right, so here we come to muscles. And I do want to point out some muscles. As usual, a lot of it is just going to be identifying where the muscle is and then giving an action. Okay, the sternocleidomastoid is going to do a lot of the neck motion. So here is a picture of the sternocleidomastoid. If you turn your neck to the side, it's the muscle that pops out at a diagonal. The sternocleidomastoid does neck lateral flexion, which means to flex it to the side. In other words, if you were to touch your ear to your shoulder, if you were just to touch your ear to your shoulder, that's lateral flexion of the neck. And it also does neck rotation. There's two bands to the sternocleidomastoid, but they work together to do those two motions. A nice review of the anterior abdominal musculature. Rectus abdominis is our main trunk flexor. A check is just shorthand for a flex. The obliques do lateral trunk flexion and rotation. And the transverse abdominis is the deeper one, and this really, I'm going to give you the fancy way, and then I'll just tell you how I think about it. Compresses abdominal contents, which really means holds everything in. Holds everything in, like a girdle or Spanx. It's the deepest, and therefore it contracts to just hold everything in. What a wonderful thing. All right, now let's talk about a muscle that you may not be as familiar with, but at this point, we absolutely have to talk about it. It is called the quadratus lumborum. We can see here it's deep. We may remember the iliopsoas. We talked about the iliopsoas as the hip flexor. Let's do this. This here is the combined iliopsoas. So we're just talking about a little bit superior to that is something called the quadratus lumborum. This is a hugely important muscle. In my opinion, it's not talked about nearly enough, so I'm doing my duty right now. The main functions of the quadratus lumborum would be to move the lower part of your trunk. So I'm going to say lower trunk flexion and lateral rotation. This is one of those deeper ones that doesn't really get a lot of credit, but it is very important, my friends. All right. On the posterior side, we have our two big back muscles, trapezius and latissimus dorsi. No one should miss those. Make sure you review some actions of those. But I want to spend time talking on maybe ones that you haven't heard of, a group of deep muscles called the erector spinae. So you can see in this picture, the trapezius, the latissimus dorsi, they have all been peeled back. And we can see it's a group of three muscles that collectively run right alongside of the vertebral column. So if that was the spine, we would have one set of erector spinae muscles on one side and then one set on the other. These are really, really, really important. As the name suggests, erector spinae. What do you think they do, erector spinae? They keep you erect, which is another way of saying trunk extension. Technically, there's three muscles that make up the erector spinae muscle group: spinalis, longissimus, iliocostalis. SLI is how I've always remembered them. You don't need to know the specific muscles, but there they are. But as a group, erector spinae, they're deep, right alongside the vertebral column, trunk extension. All right. So I'm going to move on here just because, this is the kind of thing where if I had more time, I would absolutely love to get into this, but we have to move on because of time constraints. All right. Let's move on to Roman numeral number 6, kinetic analysis. Load distribution. What do we got here? Okay. So primarily, we're going to have a lot of compressive loads. So our primary type of load is compression. And even just standing, our compressive load is meant to go down the center of our vertebral column. But this actually brings us back to those curvatures. Remember we had the curvatures? We had the lordotic and kyphotic curvatures. Have you ever wondered why we have those? In other words, why wouldn't the vertebrae just stack up like this? And the answer is right in front of us. The answer is because the arrangement of having this arrangement, it helps distribute the compressive load. If we just had the vertebrae stacked on top of each other, it would mean the only bony surface area we would have would be that. That would be so a very small bony surface area would be able to do it. But if we spread out some of these segments, it's a really bad drawing. But by spreading out some of these segments, it allows the compressive forces to be more widely distributed. So it's there for a reason. Okay, so what's the point here? The take-home points. We mostly have a compressive force due to our body weight bearing right down on it for the vertebral column. We have those curvatures for a reason, because it helps to better distribute those compressive forces so they're not just in one straight line. As you can see on your notes, the body of the vertebra takes the most of the compressive force. And number 2 would be the facet joints or zygoapophyseal joints. So the vertebral body takes on most of the compressive load. Vertebral body takes on most of the compressive load, and then the facet or zygoapophyseal joints are second in what they help to take the compressive load. All right, moving on, we can see here that those facet joints or the zygoapophyseal joints, they are oriented a little bit different. And I've drawn this out here for you. You don't need to know the specifics. All you need to know is that based on the region, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, the facet joints are oriented a little bit differently. You can see that the cervical is about a 45-degree angle in those bony surfaces touching. As we move down, it becomes a little bit more upright. And by the time we get to the lumbar, it's almost completely upright there. You don't need to know the specifics. Just know that the orientation of the facet joints is different between region. Okay. All right. So I talked about the compressive forces. In terms of the bony structures, the compressive forces are sustained by the body of the vertebrae, and then second to that, the facet or zygoapophyseal joints. But let's not forget the intervertebral discs. Hello. The intervertebral discs provide so much shock absorption. Okay. In my s'more analogy, the marshmallow is a great way to provide some shock absorption. If you put pressure on top and bottom of the graham crackers, those forces will be a little bit distributed, shock absorbed by the marshmallow. You can see some interesting information on your notes. Discs do lose water, particularly the nucleus pulposus is very watery and aqueous, so throughout the day it becomes a little bit dehydrated. This is exactly why people are a little bit shorter at night compared to in the morning. When you sleep, your body is able to rehydrate the nucleus pulposus. What do I have in my notes here? There's about a 2 centimeter decrease in height in one day. 54% of that 2 centimeter decrease in height occurs in the first 30 minutes after waking up. But again, at night when you're laying down, your body will rehydrate. Okay. Okay, I'm going to come back to the intervertebral disc bulge. So I'm going to come back to that. I want to mention shear forces, not as prevalent as compression, but is there to a certain extent. But for us, we really don't need to worry about it. Posture. So here's something we haven't had to talk about before. You know, other times when we've talked about forces and compressive loads, we've been talking about activity as we're running, as we're playing a sport. But what about in the spinal column, even if we're sitting? Forget just standing, but even if you're sitting, you will have some compressive load. So we have to discuss posture. So here are the main points that I want to point out. And I rather like this bar graph. It tells you the compressive forces, how they increase based on position. There's some interesting things here. If you're sitting, you might be surprised that sitting puts a little bit of higher compressive force than standing. And the reason why is because when you're sitting, we've taken the weight off your legs, so we no longer have any of the legs to withstand some of that compressive force. Now it all has to be on the vertebral column. Particularly, that's going to get worse anytime we slouch over. So the worst would be sitting with a slouch. Okay. So I would like you to review that we have more compressive force on the vertebral column when we're sitting versus standing. And the compressive force is always made worse when we're slouching. Over time, the effects of poor posture can lead to muscle imbalances. I think I mentioned this to some of you in lab. You know, it's pretty easy for people to want to strengthen their pectoralis major. So they tend to have really strong but tight anterior musculature, which even worsens that rounded shoulder posture. And we don't like to work out our back muscles as much, so they become weaker, and it all just makes it much worse with our posture. Okay. That's the example of the rounded shoulders. All right. You can read through the information here about the mechanics of lifting. I have my notes here in front of me to make sure I know what it is I want you to know. In terms of the proper lifting techniques, have a look at number 2 there. It's best to lift in that sagittal plane only, not add any rotation. So it's best to be in that sagittal flexion extension plane and not add rotation. It's better to lift with the legs, right? So we're using our musculature in our legs and our glutes to help bring us up. Here, we're relying on a much smaller musculature, and we're also adding a lot of compressive forces unnecessarily. And the last point here is it's better to keep the load closer to the body. That reduces the length of the effort arm and allows the muscles to generate more force relative to the lever arm length. It all comes back, well, I can't think tonight, I'm so sorry. It all comes back to lever arms, that's what I meant to say, from our chapter on the articulations. All right, so as you can see, we've gotten to the part about injuries to the neck and spine. And the only thing that I want to talk about for this one would be the disc herniations. And I'm going to go back. I want to go back to our picture of the s'more. Here we go. So what happens with a herniated disc? This is any time. Sometimes you'll hear it called a disc herniation or disc protrusion or disc bulge. Folks, they basically mean the same thing. Any of these definitions, we're just going to use disc herniation, is when a part of that nucleus pulposus leaks out and it comes out of the space where it should be, right? We want to keep the disc here, but sometimes it'll protrude out there. And the reason why that's bad is because that's where our spinal nerves are. You can see in this picture, that's why I put it on here, that portion of the intervertebral disc that bulges out will compress a nerve. And that'll lead to numbness, tingling, radiating pain all the way down that nerve and its branches, which could lead to numbness and tingling all the way down to the big toe, right? So a couple of things I want to point out. Which direction is a disc most likely to protrude? It is most likely to protrude in a posterior lateral direction. Almost always, if we have a disc bulging, it will bulge out in a posterior lateral direction. So we got to think about the anatomy here. A disc bulge cannot go directly posterior because the spinal cord is in the way and the vertebrae are in the way. So it's going to start to go kind of posterior, but because the vertebral column's in the way, it's then going to come lateral, posterior lateral. The type of mechanism that is most likely to cause this is repeated flexion. Think about someone who works in a factory, some type of manual labor job where they are bending forward all the time, lifting things, bending forward, bending forward, bending forward. When you keep bending forward, think about, this is where I like the s'more analogy. When you keep bending forward, think about putting pressure on the front of the graham crackers. If I push the front ends together, where is that marshmallow gonna bulge out? The back. So imagine constantly doing trunk flexion, constantly bending forward, constantly pushing the front ends of your graham crackers together. Where's the marshmallow going to leak out? The back. And that's the same mechanics that happens in your intervertebral disc. What is a lot of the treatment going to involve? The treatment is going to involve a lot of extension. I mean, obviously surgery is an option, but of course we want to avoid that if we can. So a lot of the initial treatment and the mainstay of treatment is going to be trunk extension exercises. Because knowing what we just talked about, if you push the front ends of the graham cracker together, the marshmallow is going to scoot out the back, just like a real disc bulges out the back, posterior lateral. So the mainstay of treatment is trunk extension. There's a whole training you can take called McKenzie extension exercises. McKenzie. The idea is if I do extension, I'm trying to smush that marshmallow back. Alrighty. I'm going to end there because I'm trying to limit the information I'm adding here right towards the end. As always, be studying what we're reviewing, and I'll see you soon.